The frigid breath of winter shrieked across the desolate plains, sounding like a predator in pursuit of the living. Great, alabaster undulations of snow drifted over the landscape, burying boundary fences, obliterating trails, and smothering the very concept of hope. At the jagged perimeter of this wasteland sat a derelict barn, a fractured, listing structure that the world had long since cast aside. Deep within that ruin, shielded only by crumbling timber and frost-bitten stalks of hay, a woman remained huddled in a tight coil. She was so gaunt, so diminished by her circumstances, that she scarcely retained a human silhouette. Valora Finch was in the final, agonizing throes of starvation. Her lips were a map of fissures and dried blood. Her hands trembled with such intensity that she could no longer command them to be still. Within the hollow of her abdomen, a searing agony writhed and clawed, a sensation so piercing it stole the very air from her lungs. It had been an eternity since her last meal, perhaps 3 days, maybe 4. Time had become a casualty of the hunger that now reigned over her consciousness. Every inhalation felt more burdensome than the one before it. Flurries of snow filtered through the gaps in the barn's siding, biting into her flesh like 1,000 freezing needles. She pulled her tattered coat tighter, seeking a warmth that no longer existed. The frost had already tunneled deep into her marrow, a permanent resident of her bones. There was a time when Valora had been a pillar of strength. Once, travelers would journey from distant counties to seek her counsel and her craft. Now, even the vermin in the walls seemed to shun her presence. With a monumental effort, she dragged her frail frame across the hay toward a small, grime-streaked window. Her shaking fingers wiped a circle into the frost to reveal the world outside. Not far away, a farmhouse stood like a dark tomb against the white. No smoke drifted from its chimney to signal a hearth, no golden light spilled from its panes. The house was a corpse. Only a few weeks prior, that home had been a temple of plenty. Sacks of flour had been stacked to the rafters, cured meats had swayed from the ceiling joists, and rows of preserved vegetables had stood like colorful soldiers on the pantry shelves. Now, it was hollow. Everything had been plundered. The thieves were the very people who had once offered her their gratitude and their orisons. Valora could still see their features in her mind's eye, neighbors she had broken bread with for decades. She saw the men whose infections she had drawn out and whose gashes she had sewn shut. She saw the women whose infants she had caught as they entered the world. They had gathered outside her home, their familiar faces contorted by a terror that rendered them monstrous. The local minister had singled out the crimson birthmark on her collarbone, branding it a seal of the adversary. When a winter fever claimed the lives of 3 village children, the community demanded a sacrifice. Valora was the most convenient target. When her husband, Samuel, stepped forward to shield her, they beat him until his strength failed. The mob dragged the couple into the public square as a heavy snow began to fall. The townspeople watched in a heavy, judgmental silence as the pastor delivered an ultimatum that was merely a death sentence in disguise: vanish into the wilderness or perish in the flames. That very night, Valora and Samuel vanished into the frozen dark with nothing but the threadbare clothes on their backs. They trekked until their feet were raw and their lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass. They did not get far enough. Samuel lacked the resilience to survive the ordeal. The combination of the brutal assault, the lack of sustenance, and the unrelenting ice broke him. He breathed his last in this very barn, his pulse fluttering away while Valora squeezed his hand, sobbing and pleading for him to stay. When the end came, she scraped a shallow grave into the iron-hard earth nearby. With numb fingers, she fashioned a cross and carved his name. For every sunset since, she had etched a tally mark into the barn's rotting wood, a grim calendar of her survival without him. 32 marks mocked her now. Valora collapsed into the hay, her fingers clutching a silver locket. It was a relic from her grandmother, the solitary treasure she had managed to conceal when the rioters arrived. She had promised herself she would barter it for bread if she reached the next settlement, but she knew now that she was a ghost. In her current state, the miles between her and salvation were an impassable ocean. The wind outside rose to a crescendo, wailing like a beast in its death throes. Her stomach gave an answering, jagged throb. For the first time since Samuel's passing, hot tears scorched her cheeks. Perhaps, she thought, the void of death would be a mercy compared to this agonizing vigil. Suddenly, the barn door was hurled open with a violent crash. A torrent of freezing air and swirling snow rushed in. Valora scrambled backward, her pulse hammering painfully against her ribs. A colossal silhouette filled the portal. Her first instinct was that the mob had returned to finish their work, but the figure was solitary. It was a stranger, tall and broad-shouldered, with an axe slung over one arm. Snow was matted into the wool of his heavy overcoat. His sheer physical presence seemed to push back the shadows of the barn. "Who goes there?" a voice boomed. It was a deep, resonant sound, reminiscent of a heavy timber splitting under an iron wedge. "This land is spoken for." Valora pressed her spine against the wood, her throat constricted by a paralyzing dread. She could barely find the breath to respond. "Mercy," she croaked. "I have no other refuge." The man stepped inside, hauling the door shut against the gale. As her vision cleared, she took him in. He possessed a dense, obsidian beard and arms that spoke of a lifetime of manual labor. His eyes scanned the shadows, eventually settling on her emaciated form. "You're the one from Belwick," he stated. The name caused her to wince. "I am from nowhere now," she whispered. His eyes traced the hollows of her face and the tremors in her hands. A subtle change crossed his rugged features. He set his axe down with surprising gentleness and reached into the folds of his coat to produce a small, cloth-wrapped parcel. When he unwrapped it, the aroma was so overwhelming it felt hallucinatory. It was bread. Fresh bread and a wedge of cheese. "When was your last meal?" he inquired. She shook her head, unable to anchor her memory. "The days have blurred," she said. "It matters to me," he countered firmly. "Eat." Her fingers shook as she took the offering. She had to fight the primal urge to tear into it like a wolf. Each swallow was a mixture of physical pain and spiritual ecstasy. "Why do you provide for me?" she asked between mouthfuls. "I seek no recompense," he told her. "Simply finish the meal." As the last crumbs vanished, tears tracked through the grime on her face. When she looked up, he was standing over her, his massive frame positioned to shield her from the drafts. "My mother was sent to the pyre when I was a boy of 10, he said, his voice dropping to a low, somber tone. "They called her a witch because she grew herbs they couldn't name. Because she knew the secrets of the soil." Something in Valora's spirit, long frozen, began to thaw. For the first time in an age, she felt truly perceived. "My cabin lies 3 miles to the north," the man continued. "A fire is banked there, and there is plenty to eat. You may find shelter there, provided you can stand." She nodded, her voice failing her. "My name is Thorly Blackwood," he said, extending a hand that was as rough as tree bark. "Can you find your feet, Valora Finch? Or shall I carry you?" While the blizzard screamed outside, Valora placed her fragile, trembling hand into his massive palm. She could not comprehend why Providence had sent this solitary woodsman to her side that night. She only knew that the trajectory of her life had been irrevocably altered. The moment she crossed the threshold of Thorly Blackwood's cabin, the air left Valora's lungs, not from a lack of oxygen, but from the sheer shock of warmth. It was a physical weight, wrapping around her and soaking into her skin like a forgotten blessing. A fire roared in a hearth made of river stone, its amber light flickering across walls of hand-hewn timber. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of pine needles and the savory aroma of a simmering stew. "Rest yourself," Thorly instructed, gesturing toward a sturdy chair by the flames. Valora descended into the seat with agonizing slowness, her nerves firing with sharp, stinging sensations as the circulation returned to her limbs. The heat was nearly overwhelming, but she embraced the sting. Only now, in the presence of safety, did she realize how close she had drifted to the edge of the abyss. Life was reclaiming her body, and though the process was painful, it was the most beautiful agony she had ever endured. Thorly moved with a quiet, efficient grace. He ladled a steaming broth into a wooden bowl and placed it before her alongside more bread. "Take it slow," he cautioned. "Your body will rebel if you force it." She followed his advice, taking small, deliberate sips. The soup was basic, yet it tasted more profound than any banquet. "Why take this risk for me?" she asked. Thorly took a seat opposite her, the firelight casting his beard in hues of burnished copper. He remained silent for a long moment. "Because when they came for my mother, no one stood in their way," he finally said. Valora paused, her spoon hovering. "You said they burned her." He gave a grim nod. "The mayor's son was taken by a fever. She had treated him with willow bark and elderberry. It wasn't enough to save him, so they called it a curse. That was all the evidence they needed." "And what became of your father?" Valora asked softly. Thorly's jaw set into a hard line. The grief hollowed him out. He followed her into the grave by his own hand a few months later. "I was cast out, left to find my way in the timber camps. I grew up with an axe in my hand." "I am so deeply sorry," she whispered. "It was no fault of yours," Thorly replied, his eyes meeting hers. "Just as the madness in Belwick was no fault of yours." A weight she hadn't realized she was carrying seemed to lift from her chest. She hadn't known how desperately she needed someone to speak that truth. "You will sleep here tonight," Thorly said, tossing another log onto the embers. "At daybreak, we will assess your strength." "Daybreak," Valora echoed. The word sounded like a foreign language. She scanned the cabin, noting the hallmarks of a man who lived in deep isolation: a single cot, one cup, one chair at the hearth. "You live out here in total solitude?" "I do," he said. Then, after a beat, "But not this evening." Before she could offer a reply, a thunderous rapping vibrated through the heavy door. Valora's blood turned to ice. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Thorly's face transformed into a mask of stone. He crossed the room in 2 strides and retrieved a shotgun from a corner rack. "Into the root cellar," he commanded in a low hiss, pointing to a hidden hatch beneath a woven rug. "Now!" She scrambled into the dark just as the wood of the door groaned under the weight of an angry fist. "Blackwood! Open this door," a man bellowed. "We know you're harboring the witch." Valora pressed her back against the damp earth of the cellar. She was surrounded by jars of preserves, the irony of being surrounded by food while hiding for her life not lost on her. Her breathing was frantic. "There is no witch here," Thorly's voice boomed from above, calm and steady. "Only a man trying to eat his supper in peace." "We tracked her through the drifts," another voice snarled. "Then your eyes deceived you," Thorly replied. "The only prints out there are mine and the wolves." The sounds of heavy boots pacing the floorboards echoed above her head. Men were arguing. Then, a voice rose that Valora recognized instantly: Silas Pewitt, the leader of the Belwick Council. "We have a legal mandate to search these premises, Blackwood," Pewitt declared. "You are standing on my property," Thorly countered, and the sound of the shotgun's hammers being cocked clicked through the room like a death knell. "I suggest you leave it." Valora gripped her locket and prayed for silence. "This isn't over," Silas spat. "We'll return with enough men to burn this shack down." "Bring the whole county if it pleases you," Thorly said. "Now, get out." The sound of retreating footsteps eventually faded into the howl of the wind. The hatch opened, and Thorly's hand appeared to pull her up. "They have retreated." For the moment. Valora climbed out, her knees buckling. They won't stop, she whispered. I've brought a curse upon your house. I should leave. Thorly stepped into her path, blocking the exit. And go where? Into the teeth of that storm? Anywhere but here. I won't be the cause of your death. You wouldn't last a mile, he said firmly. And I have no intention of surrendering you to the cold. Why? She asked, the tears finally spilling over. Why risk everything for a stranger? Because I know that look, he said, his voice softening. I know what it looks in a woman's eyes when the world decides she's a monster to hide its own fear. Valora sank back into the chair, the adrenaline leaving her body in a rush of exhaustion. My husband died because they needed someone to hate, she said. Tell me of him, Thorly invited. And she did. She spoke of Samuel's gentle soul, his passion for the first blooms of spring, and the unwavering faith he had in her skills, even when she felt like a fraud. Thorly listened with a rare, heavy attention. Honor that memory, he said when she went silent. Do it by staying alive. As the first gray light of morning touched the frost on the windows, Thorly began packing a rucksack with supplies. We depart now, he said. I know trails and hollows where they would never think to look. We? Valora asked. You won't survive the journey alone, he replied. She slept for a few hours, a deep and dreamless slumber. They set out toward the north, moving through ancient forests and over ridges far removed from any civilized road. Thorly navigated the wilderness with the ease of a man reading a familiar book. When they stopped to camp, he demonstrated how to snare game and shared the bounty with her. Where is our destination? Valora eventually inquired. To the people of my mother, Thorly explained. My grandmother still draws breath in their camp. Will they welcome a fugitive? She asked. Thorly looked at her. If my grandmother grants you her blessing, the rest will follow. One evening, as the woods fell into a deep silence, shadows detached themselves from the trees. Men armed with bows and rifles stepped into the firelight. Hunters, Thorly noted, addressing them in a rhythmic, guttural tongue Valora had never heard. After a tense dialogue, the men relaxed their stances. They will escort us to the village, Thorly said. The matriarch will make the final decision. The settlement was tucked into a high, sheltered valley that defied the winter winds. Longhouses of bark and timber glowed with internal fires. The air was a rich tapestry of wood smoke and roasting meat. Valora felt the weight of many gazes, but she sensed curiosity rather than the jagged edge of hatred. An ancient woman with braids the color of moonlight stepped forward. Her posture was regal, her eyes sharp as a hawk's. She scrutinized Valora as if reading the history written in her scars. Thorly bowed his head in respect. Grandmother. The elder touched his cheek, then turned to Valora and spoke a short, melodic phrase. Thorly translated. She asks what weight you carry in your heart. Valora took a steadying breath. Tell her I was branded a witch for the sin of healing. Tell her I lost my home, my husband, and my very soul to the fear of small men. The old woman listened, and then she laughed, not a sound of mockery, but a warm, vibrant bell of a laugh. She spoke again, and a smile touched Thorly's lips. She says that only a fool fears a woman who can mend what is broken. She says you are home. That night, Valora slept in a bed of furs, surrounded by people who did not view her as a threat. For the first time since she had buried Samuel, her sleep was not haunted by the specter of the mob. But the tranquility was short-lived. 2 days later, Thorly returned from a scouting trip with a dark expression. The men from Belwick are mobilizing, he reported. They are blaming you for a new blight on their livestock. Valora's hands instinctively went to the small pouch of herbs she had begun to collect. The water, she said suddenly. I saw the signs before they drove me out. It wasn't a curse. They are marching this way, Thorly warned. with torches and steel. A cold dread rose in her, but this time, it was met with a new, steelier resolve. Then I must confront them, she declared. Thorly looked at her with concern. They are beyond reason. They will listen if their children are dying, she insisted. And I have the proof. As the orange glow of torches appeared through the tree line, Valora stood at the edge of the camp, her head held higher than it had been in years. The winter had tried to break her, and fear had tried to erase her name, but she was still standing. The rain began to fall in a cold, gray sheet as the mob reached the clearing. The torches hissed and sputtered, the flames struggling against the downpour, but the men's fury burned unabated. Ropes were coiled over their shoulders. Silas Pewitt led the charge, his face a mask of righteous anger. "You brought your filth to our valley," he shrieked. "Our cows are dropping in the fields. Our children are burning with fever again." Silence. Valora's voice rang out, clear and authoritative. "Your cattle are dying because you are poisoning them." A wave of mocking laughter rippled through the men. "You expect us to take the word of a devil worshipper?" Silas sneered. "I expect you to use your eyes," Valora shot back. "The new silver mine upstream has been leaching tailings into the creek. It is mercury. It kills the fish, then the beasts, then your sons and daughters." The crowd murmured. Some of the men looked at one another with flickering doubt. "It is what killed the children last winter," Valora continued, her voice heavy with grief. "I tried to tell you then, but you chose a scapegoat instead of the truth." The village pastor stepped forward, his boots sinking into the mud. "If this is true," he asked, "how can it be proven?" "Test the water from the high spring," Valora answered. "Cease drinking from the creek. If the fever does not break within 3 days, you may do with me what you will." A man in the back spoke up. "The symptoms, the shaking and the hair loss, she's right. That's what the miners get." Silas, seeing his control slip, lunged toward her. "She's casting a spell on you all." Before he could reach her, a scrawny, half-starved dog bolted from the village. It was a stray Valora had fed and mended over the last few days. The animal snarled and bit deep into Silas's calf, dragging him down into the mire. In the ensuing chaos, the pastor took command. "Enough. We will follow the healer's advice. If the spring water saves our kin, we have committed a grave sin this day." By the following dawn, the sickest children of the valley had been brought to a makeshift infirmary. The very woman they had hunted now became their only hope. Valora worked until her eyes were bloodshot and her hands were stained with tinctures. She brewed detoxifying teas, applied cooling compresses to brows, and spoke words of comfort to parents who had previously called for her execution. Thorly was a constant shadow at her side, providing the physical strength she lacked, lifting heavy vats of water, carrying children, and keeping a watchful eye on the perimeter. Days passed, and the fever broke. Riders returned from the regional capital with official documents. The mining company had indeed been dumping waste, and Silas Pewitt had been receiving clandestine payments to keep the town's complaints from reaching the authorities. The shame that settled over Belwick was profound. Every charge against Valora was officially struck down. Her name, once hissed as a curse, was now spoken with a tone of reverence and apology. "We owe you a debt we can never repay," the pastor said, standing before her as the spring thaw began to turn the world green. "We have rebuilt your old home. We wish for you to return as our honored physician." Valora looked at the forest, at the rugged man who had saved her, and at the community that had actually accepted her for who she was. "No," she said softly but firmly. "My life in Belwick ended in the snow. But I will keep my doors open to any who need my help." And so she did. As the years unfolded, a great house of healing was constructed next to Thorly's cabin. It was built of stone and cedar by Thorly's own hands, a sanctuary of knowledge and mercy. People traveled from across the territories to seek the woman of the woods. Some came with whispers of her legend, others with simple gratitude, but all left with their burdens lightened. One spring evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of violet and gold, Thorly took Valora's hands in his. "The day I found you," he reminisced, "I thought I was looking at a flickering candle about to go out." She smiled, her face full and radiant. "I survived because you acted as the glass to shield me from the wind." He shook his head. "You survived because the fire inside you was stronger than the storm outside." They were wed beneath the sprawling canopy of an ancient oak, witnessed by a gathering of those who had once feared her and now called her friend. Valora Finch became Valora Blackwood, not by surrendering her identity, but by discovering the place where her soul truly resonated. The world had cast her out to perish in the winter, but she had endured, emerging not just as a survivor, but as a beacon of light that no darkness could ever extinguish.